Let's talk about strikes and let's talk about Marx. GM workers are striking. We've talked about it last week. They were the focus of the shout out. And strikes, wherever they take place, are basically the most important political pressure point imaginable for labor, for the 99%, for those who don't have power to exercise the power that they most have, which is literally their physical labor and capacity. You know, Marx centered workers in his economic analysis because of the power capacity of workers to actually strike at the capital class in that dynamic. Obviously, there's a normative desire. He wanted to liberate people from exploitation. And in fact, and I think that this is fair, the kind of classical explanation that Marx is a fusion of English economics, German philosophy, and French politics. What that meant was the technological methodologies coming from economic systems out of England, the French revolutionary politics of that time, going back to the 1770s, as well as to the 1700s, as well as, of course, the German philosophical tradition, which Marx came from through Hegel, but which he secularized. He took a teleological view, which is this idea of spirit or mind manifesting through history, through basically through synthesis and dialectical process, and made it something grounded, right? The slave and master relationship, the feudal and serf relationship, and then the capital and worker relationship. And he saw really the next phase of liberation and an enlargement of what the Enlightenment was, as that if we can liberate people in the formal political and civil realm, why can't we liberate people in the economic realm so that they're really free to exercise their capacities across all domains? And that is the core normative case of Marx, in my view. And then there's a technical analysis and an understanding of power. And workers are centered in that because when workers are amassed as workers, that is the most effective area that they can put a monkey wrench in capital. And strikes are an extraordinary expression of that. The GM strikes have made it very clear how bad, how workers feel about GM, though. GM, I should restate this. GM is perfectly illustrating this power imbalance and this ruthlessness by cutting off healthcare for GM workers while they strike. This is, of course, why an interdependent system of revitalizing labor is another essential component of why we need Medicare for all, single-payer healthcare. This is a cruel tactic that shows why we need workers' power in this country. The stakes are quite literally life and death. There's a two-tiered contract system at GM. It's an example of how defensive many unions have become in recent years. Forcing workers to compete with one another for wages puts the entire working class on the back heel. That's right. There's internal markets inside these global conglomerates that can even internally drive down wages. But this strike and the demand from the United Auto Workers to fight back against these deals show that we might be entering a new era. There's also talk of Kaiser Permanente workers going on strike. There's rumblings across the country. This is coming on the heels of, as I always mention, the incredible teacher strikes going back to Chicago of 2012 and in West Virginia and Oklahoma and California. To strategize the best way to build a future, we want to talk about, and will be beneficial to revisit some of Marx's arguments about the importance of strikes and unions in general. And this is back to the core power dynamic that I was outlining in the beginning. Marx understood the relationship between building union power and building socialism. Unlike some of his quote-unquote socialist contemporaries, and this gets confusing because this is already a broad terminology at this point in the various internal left bickerings of that time, proving that history is certainly maybe even not cyclical. Maybe it's just ongoing. Speaking of annoying left inter-bickering, but with occasional important distinctions. At this point, he was calling people Proudhon, who he's arguing with in this instance, a socialist and himself a communist. Arguing against Proudhon, Marx wrote that rather than making workers complacent, let me step back. Most of his socialist contemporaries argued that strikes aimed to improve wages for workers was both a distraction and would lead to eventual wage loss. In other words, they were ultimate accelerationist maximalists. There should be no demands inside an oppressive capitalist system. We need to get to the end goal. No intermediary steps. No actual material process. Arguing against Proudhon, Marx wrote that rather than making workers complacent, struggling to secure better wages may help them to demand more, to expand their horizons. We see this dynamic. Bhaskar Sunkara identifies it all the time in the history of democratic socialist government, and even in the context of the New Deal and Great Society. Combination, which were the precursors to unions. So when I quote Marx here saying combination, he's referring to unions, but this is the precursor to unions. Combination always has a double aim, that of stopping competition among the workers so that they can carry on a general competition with the capitalists. That's from The Poverty of Philosophy. Marx was correct. These formations did not simply disappear after a strike was finished, but rather formed into permanent unions. Friedrich Engels, too, succinctly stated that one of the most important aspects of unions by proxy strikes was abolishing competitions amongst themselves. Crucially, though, he added, they must go beyond that unless they're prepared to recede again and allow competition among themselves to reappear. And that's Engels on the condition of the working class in England. Workers taking the opportunity to build union power and to change the shape of organized labor in the U.S. goes well beyond the UAW. The recent teachers' strikes, organizing for Uber and Lyft drivers, and other examples show that this movement is growing. And we've also, of course, see global examples. We saw one great example of union solidarity, actually really from everywhere from Canada to Myanmar. We must take the advice of Marx closely and build out the double aim of organized labor. One, to stop competition between workers, and two, to take that competition to the capitalists. Putting that idea into immediate practice is demanding an end to two-tier contract system at GM and demanding a larger share from the $35 billion that GM has gained in profits. And keep in mind that $35 billion number anytime you hear some pseudo-wonk segment on NPR or elsewhere looking at the legitimate concerns of both sides. This is a raw power asymmetry, and these workers are fighting for their basic lives and survival, and actually through that, for all of us, a just, dignified, and decent life for everyone. Do you guys have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would just add, going back to Marx too, that when we're talking about these kind of concessions that the union movement accepted from GM and also from other capitalist organizations, that really is a function of class power, and the amount of profit that corporations like GM are able to extract from their workers is going to be a function of the amount of power that they have. So going back, to 2008, 2009, when everyone was very afraid of, was dealing with this massive recession and crisis, the capitalists are actually aren't as affected as workers are, because workers are in a situation where now they're worrying about, paycheck to paycheck, losing their job and not having access to the necessities of life, while capitalists are seeing a drop in their bottom line. So it's really important to build these kind of strong working class movements so that when there is crisis or anything that happens, we don't have to give away everything that we have worked so hard to achieve, and that we're able to demand what we deserve in the first place and not have to fall backwards. So building this union power is really important, and also making sure that those unions are reflective of working class interests rather than just union bureaucracy, because that's one thing that we've seen in the past couple of years that's been so successful with these strikes has actually been that it's been rank and file membership that's really been demanding the changes and has been making the shifts that are necessary, rather than people who are living in Washington, D.C. and might not always be, the first ones on the picket line.
Well, look at Randy Weingarten's disastrous, ridiculous comments undermining single payer and the infinitely most pro-labor candidate in the race. I mean, I honestly, I'm somebody who's willing to overlook a bad endorsement in 2016 because of the conditions in place then. But to still be running interference for that in 2019, disaster.
Yeah, I don't have much to say besides highlighting and I don't want to rehash anything we talked about last week, but the bureaucratic brakes on mobilization is a problem.
And that just like
Organizations that are set up to be the Washington Generals are not part of winning a socialist future.
And talking about what we were talking about last week too, with some of these older organizations versus new organizations like the DSA, I think it's really important.
New old.
That the DSA,
New
yeah,
old.
Exactly. But you go from 2,000 members to 50,000 members.
Yes,
It's pretty much a
right,
new organization.
right.
But the DSA is pursuing rank and file strategy, so actually encouraging their membership to work in union industries rather than trying to infiltrate the top union bureaucracy, which a lot of like left activist groups were trying to do for a long time. It's better to just be with the working class people in the first place.
Do the proper deployments. You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.